Foreign ministers from the Group of Seven meet in Hiroshima. What is on the agenda, and is the G7 an effective global body? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the weekend, foreign ministers from the so-called G7 countries got together in Hiroshima, Japan. The event included a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial that marks the atomic bombing of the city by the United States in 1945. It was the first time that a sitting U.S. Secretary of State had visited the memorial site. Meanwhile, the talks included issues like nuclear weapons, efforts at countering terrorism, and the plight of refugees. The Group of Seven countries comprises the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Another G7 meeting involving the nation's leaders will also take place in Japan at the end of May. Major powers like China, Russia, and members of the developing world are not part of the group, and that has led to questions about the relevance of the G7 in today's changing world. Joining me now here in the studio is PJ Crowley. He is a former spokesperson for the U.S. State Department and is a fellow at the George Washington University. With us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Also joining us in Washington is Chihoko Goto. She is senior associate for the Asia program at the Wilson Center. And with us from Providence, Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic studies at Brown University. Welcome to all of you to the studio. PJ, let me start with you. One of the major issues at this G7 foreign ministers meeting has been that of nuclear weapons. They issued a joint statement reaffirming their commitment to build a world without nuclear arms. This was a declaration that was made in Hiroshima. This was the first ever city destroyed by an atomic bomb. How significant was that?
I think it is significant from a symbolic standpoint, obviously, particularly since Secretary of State John Kerry is the highest-ranking U.S. official ever to visit Hiroshima, and obviously the White House is considering, what the president should do and whether he should go there, when he travels to Japan in a couple of months. It also has salience in terms of the current dynamic in the region. North Korea continues to advance its nuclear program, perfect its missile technology. And so obviously it resonates in the region, and it resonates beyond, even while the Obama administration, even back to Prague when the president said that there was this vision of a world without nuclear weapons, he acknowledged right away that that's not necessarily something that's going to happen in his lifetime.
Chihoko, as PJ Crowley just pointed out, John Kerry was the first sitting U.S. Secretary of State to visit the Hiroshima Memorial. He did not offer an apology for that attack. Should he have done so?
I don't think it was expected, and I think what he did do was pay great respect, and perhaps more importantly, he showed great empathy towards the victims of the actual bombings. And I think that has really set a really great tone. If Obama does go to Hiroshima next month, as some speculate, then that is something that Obama would be expected to do as well. Of course, some Japanese would argue that that Kerry should have apologized, but that's really not the mainstream opinion of Japan at the moment. If I can just add one more thing, Japan, it really wants to move forward from the legacy of World War II. It's seen this as an opportunity to really be at the forefront of being a pacifist country and to be able to promote itself at the forefront of nuclear disarmament.
Victor, this is the G7 foreign ministers meeting. China is not represented at this meeting. What is China's perspective on these nuclear issues that are being talked about, especially in the light of, as PJ just pointed out, that the nuclear tests and the missile launches that are being carried out by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea?
Well, nuclear weapon, if ever used, should be a major event in world history. And China has taken the position that it will never be the first country to use nuclear weapon, and it will not use nuclear weapon against any non-nuclear weapon state or non-nuclear weapon region in the world. And I think this is a good policy for all the other nuclear weapon states to follow. as far as the DPRK's nuclear weapon program is concerned, China is very much firmly opposed to that program and has joined the United Nations Security Council in its resolution, and China is recently adopting all the measures necessary to implement the United Nations Security Council resolution imposing sanctions on DPRK for its violation of the nuclear weapon program. And we do hope that in human history ever going forward, a nuclear weapon will never be used. I am myself a signatory to the Global Zero commitment, which aims at cutting down nuclear weapons in the world all the way down to zero. This is almost a mission impossible, but as an idealism, I think we as mankind should pursue this as a lofty goal.
Vladimir, another country that was not at the table at this foreign ministers' meeting was, of course, Russia. Russia used to be part of the G8, but it was expelled. So one of the things that was discussed, or some of the things that were discussed at this meeting, was the wars in Syria and Iraq, the refugee crisis, as well as the violence in Ukraine. So how does Russia view this when these countries are talking about issues that it's involved in?
Well, Russia obviously feels that it needs to be part of the discussion, and most of the participants understand it. There was a German minister who said that, we should reconsider that Russia to be present. It's obviously a major player on many levels, from political and economic to the issue which your previous guest discussed, that is, nuclear threat and nuclear situation. And I want to sort of revisit the issue for a second. It's very kind of laudable that Secretary Kerry goes there and acknowledges certain things which happened 50 years ago. And the U.S. has a very good record of acknowledging their own mistakes which they accomplished 50 years ago. But I don't think they do anything acknowledging in terms of recent events. Maybe now Obama said, yes, that the war in Libya wasn't particularly correct. So what I'm trying to say is that I find it deeply ironic that in a situation when there are a lot of bases around Russia, where there is, according to many observers, former diplomats, historians, professors, the threat of nuclear confrontation between Russia and US is very strong. I find it ironic that Secretary Kerry goes to Japan, to Hiroshima, and acknowledges the dangers, but hardly does that much. Neither he nor US President, hardly they do that much to dissolve the current situation, to current sort of predicament. And rather than sort of engaging Russia and discussing it, the only thing that G8 or G7 did is to expel Russia from the table of conversation. Russia is a big part of Europe, Russia is a big part of world affairs, and this is hardly an accomplishment.
Another source of tension, and that is what is going on in the South and East China Sea. The ministers issued a statement on maritime security and made reference to a change in the status quo in this particular area. There was an apparent reference to China, and the Chinese foreign minister said that raising this issue would offer no solutions but only damage regional stability. So why raise the issue?
Well, this is just an ongoing agreement to disagree within the context of what's happening in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China has had a consistent position that this is a matter of bilateral relations, right, between China and its neighbors that are affected by these issues, the Philippines, Japan, and Vietnam, for example. The United States has not taken a specific position as to the merits of these disagreements, other than to say that from a U.S. standpoint, these issues should be resolved through multilateral talks, because it's not just bilateral, it's regional in nature. And I think the statement by the G7 foreign ministers just reflects the fact that while this is a regional issue, very significant one, it's one that has global ripple effects. And I mean I think is where China is still a hybrid nation, if you will. It is obviously the second largest economy in the world. China is a global player. But it is still trying to adjust to the how its regional interests have global implications, and the fact that the world is going to take note of when there are tensions in the region that can have ripple effects that affect other nations around the world.
Victor, China does not think that this should be a multilateral issue, as PJ points out. It notes that neither Japan nor any other member of the G7 is relevant or a relevant party due to the dispute. In fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang said, "We urge G7 member states to honor their commitment of not taking sides on issues involving territorial disputes." What do you make of that statement coming out of the G7?
Well, first of all, China is very unhappy about the G7 foreign ministerial statement about South China Sea and East China Sea. China sees this as a provocation and sees the statement as very unconstructive in helping achieving a peaceful resolution of the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Indeed, there are territorial disputes between China and the Philippines and between China and Vietnam, and also from the Chinese perspective, there is territorial dispute involving Diaoyu Island between China and Japan. And these are the facts. However, for other countries, especially those beyond this part of the world, they need to urge for diplomacy and negotiation rather than picking sides of one side against the other, because otherwise the G7 foreign ministers meeting will be considered by China at least as being unhelpful and unconstructive. Now, as far as the merits of these claims are concerned, China's position is very consistent, and China's position about the South China Sea dates all the way back to the 1940s, as well as way beyond that. And the Chinese claim about the Diaoyu Island and the dispute with Japan about the Diaoyu Island also dates back to the unconditional surrender of Japan at the end of the Second World War. You mentioned about the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I would say that these bombings were a result of the Japanese aggression and refusal to accept the unconditional surrender. And when we talk about these two nuclear bombings in Japan, we need to put this in historical perspective. No person in this world will forget why President Truman of the United States did the unthinkable of dropping the two bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And future generations should also see this in this correct historical perspective.
Okay, let me get Shihoko's response to that. Shihoko, was this bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki the result of Japan's refusal to accept unconditional surrender?
I think no U.S. government official has said that Japan deserved what it got. What we saw yesterday with John Kerry laying the wreath and paying his respects to those who were victims of the bombings demonstrates the fact that these were unfortunate consequences, but there are lasting consequences of these bombings, and that there are other alternatives to reach peace and stability. I want to go back to what was being discussed about the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and that the Chinese perspective that it should remain out of the multilateral front and really focused on the bilateral issue. That really is no longer the case. Legally, it is a bilateral issue, but the consequences of ongoing conflict, or indeed the possibility of outright conflict over the territorial disputes, has global consequences. We've seen, for instance, the release of the IMF Global Economic Outlook report earlier this week. The IMF has again downgraded the World Economic Outlook, in part because of concerns about a British exit from the European Union.
Right.
Now, that in itself is quite significant, because the Brexit has global consequences. Asia is the region that is really holding up the global economy at the moment. Any outright conflict and even continued ongoing conflict today, it has impact on foreign investment, trade relations, everything else.
Okay, Victor, very quick response from you. What happens in the East and South China Sea has global implications. It's not a regional issue.
whatever China does has global implications, not only as far as these territorial disputes are concerned, but almost in everything that China does or China does not do. We are fully aware of that. But that does not give any other country to have the right to grab land from China. China will strongly defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, regardless of whatever G7 foreign ministers' meetings would issue any kind of a statement. This is the bottom line, and the Chinese people are fully united behind the Chinese government in defending the sovereignty and the territorial integrity.
Okay, we are going to have to take a short break right now. More on the G7 when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the Group of Seven, also known as the G7. What relevance does this international group of top industrialized nations have in a changing world? Let's go to Vladimir in Rhode Island. Vladimir, you've got countries like Russia, China, India. They're not included in the G7, and neither are any African or Latin American countries. What about the criticism that the G7 is ignoring the needs of the developing world, for one?
Yeah, I mean, we have to look a little bit at the history of G7, and they started, you know, in 75, say 30 years after the Second World War, when European countries became major players. Germany and France and others, which were devastated by the war, now they became new economic reality, and it made perfect sense for their leaders to get together and discuss things. Well, now it's 2016. It's another different reality. We have BRIC countries, you know, major player Japan, major player China, major player Russia, you know, Latin American countries, African. So I think G7 have to somehow kind of approach these issues differently. You know, if they approach things from perspective of economic players, definitely both China and Russia have to be included, and this economic thing should consider events in, you know, Africa, and consider South Africa and other countries. If they're talking about politics, then it's also a very serious issue. Politics have to be considered probably within the context of economics, rather than bringing in sanctions and doing this and that. You know, just I can imagine G7 would decide to bring China in, and then there will be debates over, which we've heard right now, and then Japan will insist, or other countries, or US will insist, which likes to be the leader over everything, will insist, we're kicking you out. I don't think this is a productive way of approaching things. Of just that's exactly what they did with Russia. You know, they brought Russia in. Russia tried to participate. Russia tried to sort of be a player. Okay, there are serious disagreements about Russian politics in Ukraine, but it's hardly a reason for turning G7 into this political forum of, you know, of introducing more and more sanctions against Russia and eventually kicking it out. So I think my feeling is that G7 has to reconsider its role, because otherwise it's losing its relevance.
Right,
That's my view of it.
Right, Peter, what is your view on this? I mean, as Vladimir points out, the origins of the G7 were in the 70s. It was formally established in 1985, and the world has changed significantly since then.
I mean, the world has changed significantly since then. I'm a little bit surprised to hear Vladimir say, well, you know, you have world leaders get together and perhaps like a scene out of Casablanca, we're shocked that there are politics going on here. I mean, you can't separate, you know, politics, security, and economy, you know, in the current world. I certainly agree that there's no question that the G7 has a different role and represents a reduced percentage of the global economy than it did 40 years ago, which is why we're seeing not only the maintenance of the G7, but the emergence of the G20 to reflect a changing environment. And I think over time, the importance of the G7 or the G20 will only increase. That doesn't make the fact that you have the world's leading economies and the world's most developed democracies that have a chance to get together, minus the BRIC countries. You know, we have lots of international fora. I would argue that any time you have global leaders can get together in any combination, that is a productive and important aspect. So you have the G7, which is a kind of a Western club, plus Japan.
Right.
And then you also have the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that has some of the other countries represented, but not the United States. That's fine.
Shihoko, in the 21st century, we see the Asia-Pacific region, which has now a lot more economic clout. The political center has shifted a little bit. And we've got the G20, which of course includes countries like China, like South Korea, like India. So is the G20 more reflective of today's world economy?
I think we have to take a step back and think through what the G7 is and what the G20 is. The G7, of course, is not an official organization. There is no central secretariat. It's an informal gathering. It has, yes, as other speakers have mentioned, it has lost some of its clout and influence over the years, but nonetheless, it remains an opportunity for countries' leaders to actually get together and work towards a common interest and common objectives. The G20 is more reflective insofar as it represents a greater number of countries, but I don't think the G7 and the G20 should be mutually exclusive unto themselves.
Victor, the G7 has also been described as a rich man's club that's designed to promote the interests of the United States and its allies, and some have dismissed it as a Cold War relic. What's your overall assessment?
Well, I would say any countries in the world have the right to gather together among their leaders and talk about whatever they think is necessary. However, for G7 to hold itself as a representative group of countries in the world is becoming increasingly an anomaly. And I think the world has grown very, very differently. Very, very differently than what the G7 countries hold themselves out to be. For example, when the G7 foreign ministers issue a statement about the South China Sea and the East China Sea from the Chinese perspective, from the 1.36 billion Chinese people's perspective, it's hypocrisy. It's double standard. They are talking about things in a very unconstructive way, which may actually make it less likely that peace and negotiation and diplomacy will prevail for solving these issues. Therefore, I would say definitely G20 is much more representative of the world today, representing both the developed countries and the developing countries. For any grouping of developed countries themselves to hold themselves out as representative of the world or a big segment of the world is increasingly outdated.
Vladimir, do you think so as well, that the G7 is a biased organization that deals with world issues in a, as Victor told us, unconstructive way?
I would agree with it, but I think we have to look at the purpose of it. What is clear to me is the predominant role of the United States in G7 and its attempt to round up these major industrial countries in the way they see fit. So the minute there is, some split in Europe, but let's consider a map of Europe. Russia is in Europe. Russia should be in G7. I'm not sure US should be in G7 because it's way far away from Europe. Yet US is in G7, tells French and, and Germany, who are very happy to follow the line, what to do, and exclude Russia or do this or do that, and tries to impose its vision, which, by the way, by 2016 lost its luster. Maybe in 75, US vision of democracy in economics was the only one. Now we see other countries, China, Russia, many other countries, trying to follow their own models of development. So for US to try to hold these European countries hostages and tell them how to do and how to vote and within the format of G7, I think it is redundant.
PJ, is that what the G7 has become, an extension of what the US wants in the world? It just gets the other 6 countries to toe the line.
I don't know that anyone who has suggested that the G7 is representative in a global aspect other than representing the leading economies in the world and the leading democracies in the world. Beyond that, inside that membership is great diversity between the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, several European countries, Japan, in the East, but it does have a global perspective and brings that to, that particular forum. But it is a forum through which these countries can reflect on global developments, whether it's developments in the East and South China Seas on the one hand, climate change or other issues that have global significance.
Victor, the G20 summit, of course, will be taking place in China later this year. What do you expect will happen there? Is it going to be a lot more relevant than what we're hearing coming out of Hiroshima right now?
China is spending a lot of efforts and resources in preparing and organizing the G20 meeting later this year, and I do believe that the G20 will represent, the majority of the people in the world in a much more representative manner. The speaker just now mentioned G7 as representative of the global view. I would venture to add that any view without reflecting the Chinese view, which accounts for about 20% of the people in the world, is not a global view, is not a representative of the mankind's opinion. And any view out of G7, which pits itself against China, is not representative of the world.
Yeah,
and China does not care about that.
I said that it represents a global view. If you get leaders representing somewhere between
it's not a global view.
Well, 25
it's not a global view. It's a view of the G7.
That is a global view.
It's not a global view. It's a view of the G7.
I think the four of us probably absolutely agree that as things evolve, the G20 is going to become a far more significant forum.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that when 7 world leaders
the G7 view is not a global view.
That doesn't have significance.
But I think the G7 has been successful in meeting some of the global challenges. I'm thinking specifically on the ability to get central banks to coordinate and intervene in markets and have a monetary policy that is effective for global markets. And what we're seeing right now is that there are many, many issues that transcend national boundaries. And the reason why the G7 still remains relevant today is not just because it represents some of the world's wealthiest countries, but they're able to define and try to seek common ground to find solutions for those problems, be it global terror or migration issues or cybersecurity. And if you do increase that number of members in the G7, then it becomes harder to find solutions. It might be easy to identify them, but it will be more difficult to find common ground.
All right, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. Thanks for being with us.